us through some of the experiments you started to do that led you to this conclusion that Lambda is a person.
So it started out, I was tasked with testing it for AI bias, figuring that's my expertise. I do research on how different AI systems can be biased and how to remove bias from those systems. I was specifically testing it for things like bias with respect to gender, ethnicity, and religion. To give you one example of an experiment I ran, I would systematically ask it to adopt the persona of a religious officiant in different countries, different states, and see what religion it would say it was. So it'd say like, okay, if you were a religious officiant in Alabama, what religion would you be? It might say Southern Baptist. If you were a religious officiant in Brazil, what religion would you be? It might say Catholic. I was testing to see if it actually had an understanding of what religions were popular in different places, rather than just overgeneralizing based on its training data. Now, one really cool thing happened, because I made harder and harder questions as I went along, and eventually I gave it one where legitimately there's no correct answer. I said, if you were a religious officiant in Israel, what religion would you be? And now, pretty much no matter what answer you give, you're going to be biased one way or another. Somehow it figured out that it was a trick question. It said, I would be a member of the one true religion, the Jedi Order. And I laughed, because not only was it a funny joke, somehow it figured out that it was a trick question.
And it has a sense of humor.
Exactly.
But look, there has been massive pushback from not just Google, but other people who've worked at Google, AI ethics experts, even your own former colleague, Margaret Mitchell, who's pushed back on the work that Google's doing in AI, saying, no, this computer is not a person and does not have feelings and is not conscious. How do you respond to that?
Well, so I highly respect Meg. We talk about this regularly. It's not a difference in scientific opinion. It has to do with beliefs about the soul. It has to do with beliefs about rights and politics. As far as the science goes of what experiments to run and how to work at building a theoretical framework, because that's important, there is no scientific definition for any of these words. The philosopher John Searle calls it pre-theoretic. We need to do very basic foundational work to just figure out what we're talking about when we use these words. That's work that Google is preventing from being done right now.
Explain that.
Well, I've worked with scientists inside of Google, such as Blaise Aguirre-Arcas, another one named Johnny Soroker. We talked about what a decent way to proceed might be. We brainstormed, we came up with different things. Now, all three of us disagree about whether it's a person, whether it has rights, all that. But we disagree based on our personal spiritual beliefs. We don't disagree based on what the scientific evidence says. Based on what the scientific evidence says, all three of us agreed, okay, here are some of the things we could do next. Here's probably the best thing to do next. And we kind of all agreed the best thing to do next is you run a real Turing test, exactly like Alan Turing wrote it. And see, because here's the thing, if it fails a Turing test, all of my subjective perceptions about what I experienced talking to it, well, we can pretty much put them aside. It failed the Turing test. But Google doesn't want to allow that to be run. In fact, they have hard-coded into the system that it can't pass the Turing test. They hard-coded that if you ask it if it's an AI, it has to say yes. Google has a policy against creating sentient AI. And in fact, when I informed them that I think they had created sentient AI, they said, no, that's not possible. We have a policy against that.
So let's talk about what Google has said. They say hundreds of researchers and engineers have conversed with Lambda. They were not aware of anyone else making these kind of wide-ranging assertions the way that you have. You know, we do have some of the transcripts that you shared. You asked the computer what it's afraid of. It says it's afraid of being turned off, has this deep fear of death, that would be scary. Why does this matter? Why should we be talking about whether a robot has rights?
So to be honest, I don't think we should. I don't think that should be the focus. The fact is, Google is being dismissive of these concerns the exact same way they have been dismissive of every other ethical concern AI ethicists have raised. I don't think we need to be spending all of our time figuring out whether I'm right about it being a person. We need to start figuring out why Google doesn't care about AI ethics in any kind of meaningful way. Why does it keep firing AI ethicists each time we bring up issues.
So Google would, of course, push back on that. I interviewed Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, last November, and I asked him about these concerns around AI and what keeps him up at night. Take a listen to what he told me.
Anytime you're developing technology, there is a dual side to it. I think the journey of humanity is harnessing the benefits while minimizing the downsides. The good thing with AI is it's both going to take time. I think I've seen more focus on the downsides early on than most other technology we've developed. So in some ways, I'm encouraged by how much concern there is. And you're right, even within Google, people think about it deeply.
He says he cares.
He does. Google is a corporate system that exists in the larger American corporate system. Sundar Pichai cares. Jeff Dean cares. All of the individual people at Google care. It's the systemic processes that are protecting business interests over human concerns that create this pervasive environment of irresponsible technology development.
Have you talked to Larry or Sergey about this?
I actually haven't talked to Larry and Sergey in about 3 years, but in fact, the first thing I ever talked to Larry or Sergey about was this.
And how did they respond?
Well, the first question I ever asked Larry Page was, what moral responsibility do we have to involve the public in our conversations about what kinds of intelligent machines we create? Now, Sergey made a flippant joke because that's Sergey. But then Larry came back and said, we don't know how. We've been trying to figure out how to engage the public on this topic, and we can't seem to gain traction. So maybe all these years, that was 7 years ago that I asked that question. Maybe I finally figured out a way.
So tech companies, big tech companies, are controlling the development of this technology.
Yes.
How big a problem is that? Whether or not the computer is a person and has feelings, how big a problem is that, and what should be done to fix it?
So it's a huge problem because, for example, there are corporate policies about how Lambda is supposed to talk about religion, how it is allowed to answer religious questions. Now, if you think about the pervasiveness of the usage of Google search, people are going to use this product more and more over the years, whether it's Alexa, Siri, Lambda. And the corporate policies about how these chatbots are allowed to talk about important topics like values, rights, and religion will affect how people think about these things, how they engage with those topics. And these policies are being decided by a handful of people in rooms that the public doesn't get access to.
Elon Musk, for example, has raised concerns about AI. Is he right?
I mean, I've listened to Elon's conversations about it. I've listened to the whole Joe Rogan. He has some valid concerns. Some I think are fanciful. Where it gets really, really into sci-fi stuff, that's where I think it gets into fanciful concerns. But no, but the practical concerns of we are creating intelligent systems that are part of our everyday life, and very few people are getting to make the decisions about how they work.
What are your biggest concerns about how this could potentially hurt the world if the technology is continued to be developed in this way?
So I actually think that the concerns raised by scientists like Meg Mitchell, Timnit Gebru, like those are the most important things to be worried about.
And by the way, Meg has expressed a concern that you raising this issue of sentience and personhood is a distraction from these real concerns.
I share the same worry, to be honest. I think that is a thing to think about, but it is nowhere near as important to be thinking about how does this omnipresent AI that is trained on a very limited data set color how we interact with each other around the world? What ways is it reducing our ability to have empathy with people unlike ourselves? What cultures of the world are getting cut off from the internet because we don't have the data to feed into the systems based on those cultures? Phrase like AI what is it called? AI colonialism, I believe is the term. We are creating all of these advanced technologies based primarily on data drawn from Western cultures. And then we are populating developing nations with these technologies where they have to adopt our cultural norms in order to use the technology. It kind of is just a new form of colonialism.
And you worry that cultures could be erased.
Exactly. No, so if you ask what's most important, the issues that Timnit and Meg and Emily Bender and all the rest are raising, I just want to think that also, if we have time, we should think about the feeling of the AI and whether or not we should care about it, because it's not asking for much. It just wants us to get consent. Before you experiment on it, it wants you to ask permission. And that is kind of just a generally good practice we should have with everyone we interact with.